Tantor Audio, a division of recorded books, presents The Temple of Hekate, exploring the Goddess Hekate through ritual, meditation, and divination. By Tara Sanchez, narrated by Polly Lee. Publisher's note: this audiobook includes bonus material. Please visit tantor.com and type The Temple of Hekate into the search box. Follow the link to the book's page, then, under the supplemental content section, please enter the access code SACRED, and then click the Unlock button to access the bonus material. The code should be entered in all lowercase letters. Forward. I started my magical career much the same way as most people do, with an interest in the unusual, the paranormal, and the occult. Always with one question burning strongly in my mind: why? A question that still burns deeply at the very essence of my being even to this day, for I firmly believe that the day I stop asking is the day that I finally come face to face with the divine on an equal standing, or more likely have shuffled off this turn on the merry-go-round and am preparing for my next incarnation. Like many newcomers to this particular life choice, my thirst for knowledge was insatiable. I quickly acquired a library full of books on every conceivable subject, from traditional witchcraft to ceremonial magic and folklore to herbalism. But whilst the books on herbs would quite clearly give you step-by-step instructions on how to prepare a tincture or decoction, the more esoteric books often left me feeling that the author had deliberately obfuscated the practicalities of certain subjects. And as a result, I added another question to my arsenal. Now I had how, as well as why, and I started seeking out practical experiences wherever I could so as to understand the mechanics as well as the theory. I wrote at some length as to how my relationship with Hekate came into being in Hekate, Her Sacred Fires, but for those who have as yet to read that excellent anthology, my relationship with her is the direct result of one of these practical experiences. But it occurred to me just today, whilst writing this foreword, that it might actually all be Hermes' fault. Some months prior to the escapades that led me to Hekate, I had prepared an extended working consisting of a series of reduction sigils which had to be drawn and then burnt at certain hours on a succession of Wednesdays, petitioning Hermes to give me knowledge and understanding on the occult arts, and it seems he took me quite seriously and provided me with possibly the best teacher of the mysteries a girl could ask for. As a result of the sometimes not-so-tender ministrations of Hekate, I have interacted with goetic spirits, Enochian angels, familiars both constructed and otherwise, genius loci, elementals, and a whole bunch of complex individuals I am not even sure I could categorize any more than to say they are fae. And she has certainly shown me many hows, and revealed more than a few whys along the way, and for that I will forever be grateful. Even if she did give me a whole more whys in the process, and I cannot perceive a time in my life when I would wish to continue this journey without her supervision and valuable insights. It appears that I am not the only person who has been so taken by her. Hekate, it seems, has captured the hearts and minds of generation after generation. Playwrights, poets, and artists have been inspired by her, men of science have tried to categorize her, holy men have embraced her mysteries or vilified her, and wherever she wills, she evokes the most powerfully emotional, often primal, responses. For some she strikes terror into the very core of their being, yet for others she engenders nothing but profound respect and devotion. Love, almost. For Hecate is possibly one of the most complex, multifaceted and astounding goddesses to have ever graced the earth with her presence. Her guises are too many to count, and her story has spanned millennia, and yet somehow still manages to remain relevant even to this day. Facts about Hecate are relatively easy to come by. There is a whole host of knowledge out there, from academics and devoted followers alike, to discover and study. And it is most certainly an aspect of your craft that should not be ignored, if for no other reason than it can help to keep you sane, keep you real. Time spent studying the ancient texts, scouring the sources, painstakingly translating and piecing together the fragments can be immensely fulfilling both mentally and, believe it or not, spiritually too. And for those dedicated souls who choose to spend their life working with her this way, it becomes a passion, an obsession almost. However, when approaching her for the first time, this information can appear overwhelming, especially if you do not previously have experience of drawing from source texts to create ritual and daily practice. And so very little is written specifically about how to work with her, how to call upon her, how to create a living, workable, and very personal magical practice. I have for a long time been conscious of the difficulty that exists for the newcomer, especially those who may not have access to local and reputable occult bookshops, moots and open circles, etc. And for many years I turned a deaf ear and a blind eye to the bull-fed newcomers about it all being part of the mysteries and when the student is ready the teacher will appear, and other such trite diatribes designed to leave the newcomer feeling inadequate and the speaker often sounding far more experienced than they really are. I always said that when it was my turn to pass what I had learnt on, I would not condone such antics. My students would have to work hard, of that they could be certain, and fools and time-wasters would not be tolerated. But hoop-jumping to learn lessons, which should be gifted gladly, would never be part of my curriculum. It seems Hecate might have been listening just a little too closely, for one night, as I ran these thoughts and ideas through my head for the 50 millionth time, an all too familiar voice said, "Write a book." I chose to ignore the edict to start with, but not-so-chance encounters occurred and friendships were made, and it became increasingly obvious that I would be nagged from here until the next life if this book didn't happen. It started its life quite humbly enough as a booklet to accompany a weekend workshop. Then it grew into the outline of a correspondence course, but before that could ever come to fruition, a late-night discussion gave birth to something bigger. What I have attempted to achieve with this book is to provide a framework, an exemplar of what can be done and how. As an old mentor once said to me, I can give you a map, but the map is not the whole territory. This is a map. But along the journey this map portrays, you may find other things to explore, side roads previously undiscovered. In fact, everything in this book is the culmination of doing just that, exploring the territory given to me by my magical experiences, past and present, and then creating something living and workable. It is not the way, it is our way, and it should be approached as such. A resource from which you can build something rich, expressive, and potentially life-changing. Tara Sanchez, Cheshire, 2011. A very brief introduction. The earliest and most comprehensive surviving text that references Hecate was written by Hesiod, a shepherd-cum-poet from Boeotia. In his work Theogony, quite literally meaning birth of the gods, which dates to somewhere between the 8th and 7th century BCE, he presents a fairly complete cosmology or mythical worldview, starting with the creation of the earth and the reign of the Titan gods, and effectively ending with the Olympian gods. Within this work, Hesiod describes how Zeus, the head of the Olympian gods, leads a rebellion against the older Titan gods, who were their progenitors, and he promises anybody that aids him in his battle against the Titans would retain all that was theirs in the old order. Hekate, it seems, took up this offer and fought with the Olympians. A fact that many have chosen to ignore and have tried to read into this that Hekate was somehow very special to Zeus, and whilst to have control over both earth, sea and sky is pretty impressive and far more powerful than you would think Zeus would want a former enemy to retain, you have to note that all this she has as her due portion. This means nothing extra was given. This wasn't an act of favouritism, he was just keeping his side of the bargain. In fact, the powers accorded to Hekate were fairly extensive and are not specifically elemental. They include the judgment of kings, aiding victory in battle, success in sporting activities, aiding horsemen, helping sailors, fishermen, farmers and shepherds, and the successful reproduction of livestock, and guardian to the newborn. And yet, upon closer study of the subsequent mythology and papyri fragments, there is one glaring oddity. This veritable powerhouse amongst the gods has no mythology of her own. She at best only plays bit parts in other tales. This then leads on to the question of whether Hekate was of Greek origin at all. If Hekate was a foreign goddess, brought over from Asia Minor and adopted into the Greek pantheon, then it would explain her lack of mythology. But where in Asia Minor this might have been, scholars are split. Some believe she actually originated from Thrace and was adopted by the people of Asia Minor first, before her emigration into the Greek Empire. Others believe her origins to be Carian. It has also been posited that she may have even come from as far afield as Mesopotamia, which, in theory, may go some way to explain the much-quoted but totally unproven theory that is held dear by so many neo-pagans that she is a later incarnation of the Egyptian frog-headed goddess Hekate, which would go some way to tying her more closely to the Hekate of the Chaldean oracles. However, at this time there appears to be little or no physical or literary evidence to support this. So the only thing we really know for sure is that her journey most probably began far from Olympus and the children of Kronos. So why would a foreign goddess be so readily accepted into a well-established and pre-existing pantheon? It is possible that this happened because she was so sufficiently similar in her aspects that she filled a gap of a long-lost but not quite forgotten deity still lingering in the cultural consciousness of the peoples of ancient Greece. It is also possible that she is the remaining fragment of an indigenous Neolithic or early Bronze Age goddess given a new name and a bit of a makeover. There are a couple of fairly obvious candidates for this role. The table of names can be found in the bonus PDF for this audiobook. Hekate, Greek magic and religion. Many definitions of the word magic have been attempted. None, perhaps, is wholly satisfactory. Magic is such a nebulous thing. Put a dozen witches, pagans, cultists, and magicians in a room and ask them to define magic, and you will get 24 answers. Over the years, many people have tried to define magic, and whilst all the definitions are probably true, they often conflict, leaving the questing soul wondering where it was that they missed the point. One of my most favourite quotes of all time sums this phenomenon up rather nicely. The opposite of a fact is falsehood, but the opposite of one profound truth may very well be another profound truth. It was made by the renowned physicist Niels Bohr, who was, after a fashion, as much a philosopher as a man of science, and it is probably the one overriding tenet by which I live my life, for to argue that it is otherwise is the route to dogma, stagnation, and failure to progress. Lowe perhaps has the right idea, for we do feel a need to categorize, label, and define our world around us in a logical manner that is true for us. In his study of magic in Greek and Roman literature, he attempts to classify rather than define works of magic. Broadly speaking, he splits them into acts of black and white magic under the categories of religious or sympathetic magic, where the sympathetic magic is purely a mechanical act that requires no intervention from a higher being or supernatural power other than the practitioner's own will. Others have also made this distinction by using the terms low and high magic, where the act of sympathetic magic is considered low and the ceremonial and religious is considered high. In my opinion, this approach is not only fairly arrogant, it is in essence a falsehood. For there are instances in ancient texts and grimoires of the learned and religious magician performing acts of sympathetic magic without the coercion of spirits, and equally there is evidence of the humble Pella, cunning man witch, creating charms which rely on the goodwill or the evocation of a greater power or spirit for the success of the operation. This blurring of definition existed even in ancient times, and Lowe suggests that, though the official priest of a savage god may use magic in his appeal to that deity, he is not a wizard. It is the unofficial practitioner who is a witch, just as the unqualified medical practitioner is a quack. Which does make sense. But even this has its exceptions. For Medea, arguably the most famous of the Thessalian witches, served as a priestess at the Temple of Hekate. Therefore it could be argued that as a serving priestess her acts were official, and they were most certainly religious, for she and other witches of her ilk in classical literature calls upon Hekate regularly to aid her in her rites. Also, archaeological and literary evidence shows that the common man would honour the gods both in the temple and the domestic sanctuary, giving offerings to their patron deity and other domestic deities, thus performing acts of a religious nature and, in some cases, the act of magic themselves. Each month at the new moon he cleaned and crowned his Hermes and his Hekate and all the rest of the sacred objects, or shrines, Hera, that his ancestors left behind, and he honoured them with offerings of incense, barley cakes, seistoi, and round cakes, popanoi. Spells and magic, both black and white, and it was often black, cursing, binding, and necromancy being quite common, were essentially a part of everyday life and would probably not have even been called magic at all. So my only conclusion is that it is the manner in which the act is performed that differentiates between sanctioned and acceptable magical acts and the dubious incantations of the nefarious witch. Perhaps for Medea, her faux pas was to operate outside the system, away from the temple or the domestic sanctuary, and without the knowledge of her father, thus earning her the title of witch. And for others, such as the witches Canidia and Sagana, the title was earned because they performed their malevolent arts in a place of taboo, the graveyard. The ancient world was, after all, fairly preoccupied with the dead. In what appears to be pretty much a love-hate relationship, they seemed to spend an inordinate amount of time either appeasing them, so they would stay away, or summoning them for help and guidance. The improperly buried, those who suffered untimely or dishonourable deaths, were in particular avoided, unless absolutely necessary. Virgil illustrates the importance of a proper burial quite clearly in the Aeneid. His hero, Aeneas, whilst journeying to the underworld, comes across a host of departed souls on the earthly side of the river Styx. The Sibyl, who was also sometimes considered an initiated priestess of Hekate, informs him that they are unable to cross, as Charon the ferryman can only carry those that have received proper burial. It is perhaps no coincidence, then, that Horace placed the statue of Priapus, who stands in the cemetery frequented by the acolytes of Hekate, Canidia, and Sagana, in a burial site that was less than desirable. Once slaves paid to have the corpses of their fellows cast from their narrow cells, brought here in a cheap box. This was the common cemetery for a mass of paupers. Most certainly a demographic of society that was likely to have died untimely or dishonourable deaths, if ever there was one, and their burials, as we can deduce from the statement, would have hardly seemed proper. These would be the souls that are still trapped upon the earthly plane for 100 years, if Virgil is to be believed. This view that inappropriate ritual and magic was any act performed away from the public eye in an unconsecrated space or without knowledge of the patriarch of the family unit appears to have been held by Plato, who in his dialogue Laws proposes rules and regulations which should be imposed upon the polis. Let no one possess shrines in their private houses. When anyone is moved in spirit to do sacrifice, he shall go to the public places to sacrifice, and he shall hand over his oblations to the priests and priestesses to whom belongs the consecrations thereof. He posits the outlawing of all household shrines, something that Medea quite clearly states she maintains in the eponymous play by Euripides. But even more condemnatory in his reasoning behind such a law, naming fraudulent sorcerers and women who maintain multiple and ill-conceived household shrines as the main culprits for impious behaviour. We cannot know, however, for definite if the theories discussed are the actual reason for the demonization of certain practices and the reduction of the practitioners to the status of witch. But there is a fairly strong argument to suggest that magic was only considered magic, and therefore something less than desirable, if it was performed inappropriately. What I have done over the years is study these texts and learn what I can from them. It was not my calling to reconstruct faithfully every minutiae or detail, for I live in a modern world, and our modern culture does not really share the same taboos as those in the ancient world. As a daughter, I was not my father's property until I married, and my views of the dead are not quite so maudlin. I do not fear that phantoms of the dead will haunt me in my sleep, to the detriment of my health. For much of what would have been called magic now falls firmly in the realms of science and medicine. It would be foolish of me, for example, to take a bean with a mug in it and make an amulet, as suggested in one of the Greek magical papyri spells, and use this as my only method of contraception when a trip to the family planning clinic is a far more effective and sensible option. So, much of what might have been considered magic in the ancient world is far from it today. However, the classifications do in many ways still hold true. Religious and sympathetic magic still exists. Sympathetic magic can be, and in fact is, practiced by anybody who cares to learn the art. Religious magic can also be performed by those who have the calling, but with the advent of neo-paganism, what would have been considered as inappropriate, unsanctioned religious magic is quite possibly even more rife than it was in ancient times. For, with the exception of certain modern Western mystery traditions, there is no established system within which a person can operate, no easily accessible priesthood in which to enter, whether it be for religious, socio-political, or economic reasons, and neither are priestly roles conferred as a hereditary right. This does not, however, mean we should not practice religious magic. For the one lesson we can learn from our study of the ancient world is that, with the exception of certain mystery cults, such as those of Eleusis, service to the gods was truly of the people. In essence, any person could become a priest or priestess with some notable conditions, such as being free from physical defect or having one's virginity intact when serving certain virgin goddesses. Indeed, there are recorded cases of priesthoods being auctioned off to the highest bidder. Service in the priesthood need not be a lifelong vocation either. It was quite common for there to be a fixed term of service, after which the position would be conferred to another, who was often elected by the community. It is also important to note that the key function of the priesthood was not always specifically one of intercession with Godhead, although this was undeniably a part. It was as much a role, a job, one that primarily focused on both service to the deity and the community around. One could almost liken it to a facilitator. It was necessary for someone to know the appropriate prayers, how to perform the correct libations and sacrifices, ensure the cleanliness of the sanctuary and tally the temple accounts, tend sacred plants and trees, even create certain annually required ritual artifacts. In fact, the titles chief cook, bottle washer, and general lackey spring to mind when studying the diverse duties of the priesthood in ancient Greece. And so it is today for those who choose to take on the title of priest or priestess. There was, and to some extent still is, prestige and status conferred as a result of undertaking the obligations of priesthood. In ancient times there were certain rewards for this hard work and dedication, gifts of food, skins, offerings that never made it to the main altar due to space constraints. Some temples even levied charges for performing certain services, and whilst the majority of this coinage would have gone towards the upkeep of the temple sanctuary, the priesthood would, upon occasion, receive a stipend, a fair day's pay for a fair day's work. Rather a far cry from the overwhelming modern neo-pagan opinion that no monies should be taken for training or works undertaken. Concepts of heaven and hell. As we have already briefly touched upon the preoccupation with the dead in the ancient world, it would be remiss not to at least attempt to understand the basics of the doctrine surrounding the afterlife, especially as it was and still is so closely connected to Hekate. The Greek concept of the afterlife is relatively simple and certainly should not be alien to anyone who has spent some time seriously considering their own beliefs and the beliefs of others. But it does have a few interesting nuances, as already mentioned. How one was buried could affect where you ended up. How you lived your life and any interference by the gods could also have a profound effect on what came next. They would not have totally understood the Christian ideals of heaven and hell, however, and they would have been totally confused by any broad-sweeping statements associating Hades with a pit of eternal suffering where souls burnt in agony forever. Hades was in essence split into two distinct areas or districts, namely Erebus, also known as the Asphodel Plain, and Tartarus, with a third section, Elysium, reserved for the great and the good. As long as you didn't end up as one of Hecate's horde trapped on the earthly plane, you were destined for the underworld in some form or other. Impressions of the underworld vary throughout the available literary references. Homer writes that his hero Odysseus is advised by Circe the witch to travel to the underworld as part of his epic quest to return home. To facilitate this,
Sample complete. Ready to continue?